So now that we've talked about all that, we have to pose the question, what would a feminist city even look like? This is probably one of the most popular questions that I get. When I'm talking about this subject, it's what people want to jump to, the image or the visualization, the actual design elements that would make a feminist city work. People want to know what's different from our contemporary cities. They want to know what changes need to be made on the ground to enact an equitable place. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, I want to bring us back to some of the content from the first course. When we were talking about iconography, we were talking about the way people lived. We were talking about our belief systems and our culture as expressed through art. Importantly, we understand that we are the same people then as we are now. At one point in time, we had some sort of shared ideology. It represented a connection to the earth, and it represented our communal understanding as a species on this planet. But over time, that shifted to a hierarchical social system. It shifted to something that was looking towards the heavens, something that really brought down a divine right and placed it in the hands of the male elite. While we don't know why exactly that happened or how, we still see the effects of it today. Our societies and our cities are male-dominated. If you wish to call that patriarchal as a system or misogynist, that is still accurate. The fact remains that if you look out your window in any city in the world, wherever you are at this moment, the city itself was not built for women. It was only built by and for men. This is the inequity we've been discussing in this entire course. We've been trying to have a different perspective on the issue in order to put it into a contemporary lens, but we also need to look backwards in order to bring the positive elements that we all exhibited in the past into the future city. At one time, we were able to come together. We understood the significance of a shared communal area. We understood the value of sharing goods and resources, and we also understood the challenges and danger of a hierarchical top-down power structure. I want to reiterate some of the positive benefits from this time period, but I want to focus on one in particular, which is an ecosystems thinking approach to our urban environments. When we build cities, we're not only building buildings themselves and streets and transportation systems and homes to live in, we are in fact, from an anthropological perspective, creating an artificial ecosystem on this planet. We invented cities in the past, and they've taken many shapes and forms over time. While cities have always been constructed from one group of our species, in particular, men, they have taken different forms. This is not to say that one single form is correct, and it's not to say that none of the cities in the past haven't worked well for the people who lived in them. But it is a very rare occasion to find a city that truly has integrated itself into the broader environment around it. That separation between nature and our built environment is what actually creates many of the issues that we see today. That separation is a male-dominated system, and we can also see this in the future cities that have been proposed by male urbanists and visionaries of the past. One thing we can notice about Çatalhöyük in particular is the organic nature of the buildings themselves and the spaces around them. Organic or nonlinear does not necessarily mean that it is more holistic or communal. But it is interesting to think about the bottom-up way that humans impacted our environment at that time. It suited their needs, and it represented, once again, that communal atmosphere that society had at the time. And while we do not necessarily have plans for cities like Ur or Uruk, large complexes that were again built top-down in scope, we do have other examples of town planning and ideal city visioning that were made by men over time. Some of these, like Palmanova, were actually constructed. Every construction of this type in this symmetrical way was meant to again impact an ideal or a vision onto society. Every decision is made by someone. Everything in our society has been invented by someone at some time. And whether enacted by an individual or a collective understanding and agreement, everything can also be remade at the same time. This city structure was built for a very explicit purpose. At this time, warring nations had to think about the walls that surrounded their cities. The hinterland would exist outside of the walls and produce things like food and house serfs and other slaves relevant to this area. But the city itself was a center for commerce. Housing the elite meant that that command center was of utmost importance to society. Much like the skyscraper, the tower at the center was really the pinnacle of all of the rules that was holding society together. Dividing a city in such a way was meant to be orderly, to put people in certain places, as has been done with many hierarchical systems over time. If this person had their way, every city would be designed in such a way because it represented the ideals of the time. Roman-era cities did a similar thing with their military towns, whereby the same structure was replicated across the countryside. But there were many future city ideations that were actually never constructed. In the 1920s, there was a huge boom of ideal city visions. Fueled in part by a resurgence of globalism ideals, for instance, manufacturing, wealth, and so forth, we see architects come to the forefront with big ideas that many times were never actually enacted. This model city, envisioned by one man only, was meant to be a rational and symmetrical urban environment that would cause social change. This is not the kind of social change that we find when we take the kitchen and turn it inside out, as has been discussed in a prior course. But this is the kind of social change that really upheld efficiency at the height of everything that was going on within it. Rather than thinking of a city as an ecosystem, this was thinking of the city as an engineering project, essentially as a machine, something that could be more efficiently operated and predicted in terms of human behavior. By placing the buildings in such a way from this top-down perspective, oftentimes done over a table with models, the architect is playing God. They dictate where and when and how you get around a city based on their ideas of what the best urban form is. Had these ideas been taken into account in a real city in today's world, we would have seen mass destruction of major downtown areas. This is the extreme, but the same thing did take place in cities around the world. Obviously, many cities in the United States took this idea to heart and created high-rises as the basis for affordable housing. Later, many of these structures were destroyed because they did not take into account the on-the-ground social structure of the people living within them. Other high-rises were also constructed, and as Holly White observed in New York City, did not often take into account the public spaces that were at the base of them in the city itself. People's ability to manipulate such a rigid or rational environment, as Le Corbusier liked to put it, meant that there was no ownership over place. This is a soulless city. There is no ability to modify it, and there is no co-creation involved should it have been enacted as it is inscripted here. Following in the footsteps of the Radiant City, Frank Lloyd Wright's idea was called Broadacre City and was created in the 1930s. It's a similarly modern vision, but is a little bit more descriptive in the way that life would have looked like in that city in particular. There is still a tall tower in the center, which represents that command center concept and the power of the people that are in control over that environment. However, Frank Lloyd Wright did take greater consideration into the surrounding environment and attempted to integrate the city into that wider ecosystem. Even still, we see this fall trap to these futuristic visions that still persist for cities today. Elements like flying cars even persist in futuristic visions of the city today. While these kinds of visions are often projected as an ideal, again, something to shoot for, but not necessarily construct as written, it is still really important to understand that the representation of that ideal drives the way forward for the rest of us. These architects were incredibly influential, and many people attempted to follow in their footsteps. They really looked up to their ideas, and if these were the ideas for the future city, then they absolutely made an impact on the cities that we have today. In particular, this patriarchal future city, much like the past, really prioritizes a few key elements that might actually be detrimental to our society as a whole. The first of which is innovation, meaning high-tech inventions. Smart cities are the contemporary example of this in many cases, whereby flying cars or autonomous vehicles and so forth are projected as the future transportation option for all of us. Without necessarily consulting us, it is expected that that is the natural evolution of our auto-dominated lifestyle. There's also an understanding that cutting edge is good regardless of the impact. Something that is radical and innovative means that it has to have never been seen before or be something incredibly new and out there in order to attract attention. This is much in the same way that, quote, starchitects create a building that may not be created but causes a sensation amongst its audience. There's also a continued emphasis on skyscrapers and high-density living. While we do need an increased amount of density to accommodate our large populations on this planet, there is a difference between high-rise living and a density which could actually be sociable and sustainable at the same time. Again, we see a continued reliance on automobiles as well as a continuation of symmetry or very top-down controlled design elements. There may be more green space in modern cities, but oftentimes it's a very prescriptive environment. It may be integrated into those high-rises for sustainable purposes, or it may also just be highly manicured and outlined as an element in a design drawing more than a reality on the ground. Unfortunately, what you won't see is a picture like this. I've illustrated this image before and talked about all of the major design elements and behavioral components that we can witness in this really excellent urban environment. This is Amsterdam, and in many ways this is the future ideal city for other cities that have not enacted these programs. We look to this city as an ideal, as urbanists that are emphasizing the human experience on the ground, but for some people it's already a reality. The question then remains, what is innovative to a resident in a city like Amsterdam? Are they looking for new technology or ways of thinking or fancy buildings to actually upend their current good quality of life? That would be strange if they were, and in some cases it is being proposed by individuals at the top. The question then is, why is there a need to dramatically alter such a good urban environment in the first place? This is the same question that I ask when we think about our ancient cities and the way that we used to live. Innovation does not have to be new, and in many ways, if we look back, we can bring those ideas into the forefront. Interestingly, when I ask women this very question around the world, that's the kind of response that I get. Many elements that we already understand, principles that we can actually witness on the ground in this moment, but just a request to improve or increase these things wherever these women live. Most of the radical ideas that we find here are actually ideals or concepts that drive forward these design changes that we already understand. In this example, at South by Southwest in 2018, I asked a room of women what they thought a women-led city would look like. These women came from various places, and I wanted them to showcase where their perspective and personal experience was also coming from. Each person took a tag, wrote down their core ideas, and affixed it to a map based on their location of origin. And this is a selection of what we heard. Much like we have talked about in this course, women really emphasize things like monuments, representation of people like them, so that they can see examples of women who have done great things. Public restrooms, which we didn't touch on too much in this course, were also of a key concern, considering that women often travel with children in tow. Families and kids, though not mutually exclusive to the female experience, were also a core idea that was brought to the table. And design elements like protected bikeways were also incredibly important. These things are intrinsic. They're understandable. They're ideas that we already have that we've tried to push forward over time. We know it makes a good public space, but what is the incentive behind these actions that are taking place? More than just a sustainable city, many of the women also responded about the intent behind these actions. One person in particular said it should be more empathetic and compassionate. How is that expressed in the built environment? Or a city that is built by all of its population, not only powerful people. Many of these women in this room were not experts in the subject. They were simply interested in talking about it because it really resonates with their experience as a woman moving through a city. As we all move through cities at some time, we all have our own experiences and we intrinsically understand what works and what doesn't work, especially when we think critically about it. Without any prompting, one woman also responded, instead of investing in sports arenas, we should invest in wellness centers or something that really deals with the holistic needs of a human being in an urban environment. And in a true communal moment, one woman even suggested circular empowerment. Again, intrinsically understanding many of these ideas that do not exist in our cities today. To this end, I was able to summarize some of the characteristics of a pre-patriarchal city and society in order to bring that into the future. Again, looking back at peaceful areas, no hierarchical systems, no single rulers per se that have control over everything, and this communal element in ecosystems thinking way of designing a city, all of which can be modernized and brought into the future. The feminist future city then, as I have found it to be. Firstly, it is co-created, building trust through communication both top-down and bottom-up in the city systems, and being responsive to the needs of both groups. It is also communal, treating the city as a collaborative exercise in ecosystems building that is more like a home than not. And thirdly, compassionate. A place that brings care and love for our fellow human beings to the forefront of the urban conversation and doesn't treat it as something on the side that is a nice to have. In the next section, I will go over each of these in turn and give you positive examples of the impact on the ground that we can see today.